racial oppression. There was really high levels of support in the summer of 2020. So if you look at polling from that period, consistently you find around 2/3 of Americans supported the racial justice protest. And so this was really remarkable when you think about how politically polarized our country is, to have that level of support for the protest, especially on such a hot button issue. You had ideas enter into public discourse that had previously been seen as outside the realm of political possibility. Proposals to defund the police, to pursue strategies outside of policing to promote public safety. But despite all the attention and the debate on these issues in recent years, on a lot of metrics, policing hasn't changed that much. So I'm just going to look here at fatal shootings by police annually in the US. Obviously, high profile incidents of police violence were some of the sparks that led to the protest, but we haven't seen meaningful declines in fatal shootings by police in the US. If anything, there's been a slight tick upward in recent years. Beyond just the numbers, there have also been very high profile incidents of police brutality. Earlier this year, officers in Memphis, Tennessee, brutally killed Tyre Nichols. This was an incident every bit as horrific to the killing of George Floyd. It occurred after a traffic stop. Nichols was defenseless and beat to death by several officers. And so when we see incidents like this, it raises the question, what has changed and where do we go moving forward? And two proposals that have come to dominate a lot of the debate is, one is that we need to end the police entirely. We need to abolish the police. And obviously this was a proposal that gained a great deal of prominence during the Black Lives Matter protest. One specific proposal that you found in many cities was to cut police budgets by 50% as an intermediate step to eventually abolishing the police. And the rationale behind this approach is that the police do not prevent crime, they're not helping communities of color, and that we would be better off without them, given the immense harms that they can inflict. Now, among political officials, this idea has proved much more controversial, and there's been a lot of opposition to it, both on the political right and the left. Biden very much has posed ideas to both abolish and defund the police. This was a point that he emphasized during his State of the Union address in 2022. There, he said we should all agree that the answer is not to defund the police, it's to fund the police with the resources and training that they need to protect our communities. And this perspective recognizes that there are problems in policing, that there needs to be reforms implemented, but that the underlying structures of law enforcement can largely remain the same, and that with a few reforms here and there, we can get policing to where it needs to be. And both my co-author and I, we found these positions to be unsatisfactory, and that we really felt that they failed to grapple with a lot of the social science research on policing. And it was that dissatisfaction with both of these positions that was part of the impetus for deciding to write this book. So one body of evidence I want to focus on is the relationship between policing, crime, and violence. The abolitionist position oftentimes will make the argument that policing doesn't have much of an impact on crime. And this is a position that you could, if you go back several decades, you could find some support within criminology. Many criminologists were skeptical of police's ability to reduce crime and violence, but that view has really changed within criminology in recent decades. And there have been a couple of factors that have contributed to that shift. There have been police have adopted new strategies and tactics that are data-driven. There have also been more sophisticated research methods to examine causal relationships between policing, crime, and violence. And now the consensus within criminology is that there are at least some interventions within policing that are effective in reducing crime, including violent crime. Notably, there was a 2018 report by the National Academy of Sciences that reviewed the large body of data on policing's relationship with crime. And the conclusion from that report was that certain forms of policing are effective in reducing crime and disorder. Some of the interventions that they pointed out where there's growing evidence for their effectiveness are hotspots policing, where police identify geographic areas with persistently high crime and dedicate more resources to those areas. And also what is known as focused deterrent strategies, where police dedicate extra resources to groups and individuals disproportionately responsible for violence in communities. So a lot of these interventions are focused on gang violence. Those findings are relevant from an anti-racist perspective because when there are reductions in crime and violence, those benefits tend to disproportionately benefit communities of color. And someone who's done pioneering work in this area is Patrick Sharkey at Princeton University, a sociologist. And he's really looked at the broad effects that violence has in communities, how devastating it can be on a number of different metrics, from school achievement to mental health, welfare. And the graph here shows the impact of the decline in homicide rates in the US on life expectancy. So between 1991 and 2014, there was a dramatic decline in the homicide rate. It was reduced by over 50%. And what Sharkey and his colleague Michael Friedson looked at is, well, how did that affect life expectancy rates in the US by different demographic groups? And what they found is that it had the biggest impact on African American males. So what this graph shows here, the solid line is the life expectancy by year for African American males in the US. And then the dotted line is the counterfactual of what the life expectancy would be if there wasn't that decline in the homicide rate. And so you can see that gap grow, especially by the time we get to 2014, and you have an added 0.8 years of life expectancy, in part due to that drop in the homicide rate. I don't have the entire graph here because including it would have been a little just sort of difficult to look at on the slide. But when you look at these same figures for other demographic groups, especially white Americans, you find that the solid line and the dotted line pretty much follow the same track, and that the decline in homicides didn't bring the same benefits that it did for African Americans, especially African American males. So if there are interventions that can reduce violence, that's very important from an anti-racist perspective. But when we analyze policing, that cannot be just the only thing that we look at, because we also know that policing has inflicted a great number of harms on communities of color throughout US history. You go back to the periods of slavery and Jim Crow, police have often been complicit in various forms of racial oppression. And so when we engage in an anti-racist analysis of policing, these harms have to be just as much at the center of the analysis as any benefits that policing may provide. Also, especially troubling is the persistence of racist attitudes that you find, at least amongst some segments of law enforcement. It's not difficult to find stories of officers posting racist views on social media and other disturbing comments. And so when you have this sort of culture, it's very difficult to expect that police are going to be partners in advancing anti-racist goals if they're expressing racist attitudes themselves. Also, when we look at a variety of data on policing, we find that its harms fall disproportionately on people of color. So you look at stop and frisk, traffic stops, arrests, SWAT team deployments, use of force, and all these different areas, people of color are disproportionately harmed by these police practices. And in many cases, the racial disparities cannot be explained by differences in behavior. So for instance, Black and white Americans use drugs at around the same rate, yet Black Americans are arrested for drug use at a much higher rate than white Americans. And so when policing inflicts these disproportionate harms on communities of color, obviously that counts against it when we're engaging in an anti-racist analysis. So in the book, we call this policing's catch-22, and it's the dilemma that communities of color face. They can turn to police to reduce violent crime, but that's going to come at the cost of bearing the brunt of policing's harms. On the other hand, they could choose to rely less on policing and avoid some of the harms associated with it, but at the risk of an increase violent crime. If we're truly committed to an anti-racist approach to public safety and policing, we cannot continue to put communities of color in this no-win predicament. So what we're trying to do in the book is to chart out a path where we can overcome this catch-22. And what we argue is for a third way between the alternatives of limited reform that often leave all sides dissatisfied and police abolition. And in this approach, we're really focused on building institutions of public safety where the police are one element of this public safety approach. And importantly, they're going to be partners rather than barriers in anti-racist work. So this approach has three core elements to it. The first is, and this is sort of the low-hanging fruit, there are a number of interventions out there, policies that have been shown to be effective in reducing the harms of policing, particularly in communities of color. So these are reforms related to use of force, related to traffic enforcement, and these can largely be implemented without dramatic changes to the underlying structure of police agencies. And so because of the benefits that these types of reforms bring, they should be adopted and and we need to pursue them. But if we stop there, we're still not going to overcome the catch-22 that policing poses because of the problematic aspects of police culture and the structure of police agencies. So there also needs to be focused work on transforming the culture and incentives in policing through changes to the institutions of law enforcement. And so that's another big chunk of the book that we focus on. And then lastly is taking a broader approach to public safety. Too often policymakers suffer from a lack of imagination when it comes to promoting public safety. When they are trying to address the issues of crime and violence, they see the police as the only tool in their toolkit to do that. And that's problematic because when there's an over-reliance on police, and especially harsh police methods, communities of color are the ones that bear the brunt of those harms. And moreover, because policing relies on force, there's an inherent harm to policing. And so to be able to justify reliance on the police, it has to be necessary. If there are less harmful measures out there that can achieve the same public safety goals, then we need to adopt those measures and use them in our approach to public safety. And if we're continue to rely on policing when they're less harmful ways, we're violating the principle of necessity, which is sort of a key principle that needs to guide our work. In just some examples in terms of other public safety strategies where there's evidence of their effectiveness in reducing crime and violence, they include installing streetlights, cleaning and greening vacant lots, youth job programs, youth counseling programs, civilian crisis response teams, expanding healthcare access, expanding mental health care offices, also more local nonprofits. And so there are a variety of tools available in efforts to promote public safety that don't involve the police. And it's important for policymakers to make room for these other tools and have a holistic approach to trying to make communities safer. Now, this work, we're under no illusions that this is going to be easy work because the problem of racial bias in policing is very much a wicked problem. It's connected in complex and often uncertain ways to other broader problems in society, systemic racism in society. And this is a point that Seth Stoughton, who's a former police officer and now law professor at the University of South Carolina, made during the summer of 2020. And so we have to recognize this is incredibly complex, difficult work, and it's going to take time. But I don't think that's reason for despair, because on other wicked problems, we have made progress. There were once infectious diseases that killed millions of people, and we were able to eradicate them. So what are some principles that can guide us in confronting the sort of wicked problem that we find in the connection between racism and current forms of policing? One is we have to have a commitment to epistemic humility. There's a lot of uncertainty about what sort of interventions are going to be most effective from an anti-racist perspective, especially when they're scaled up. And so we have to make sure to adjust our beliefs when new evidence comes in, and we shouldn't by any means expect that we're going to have all the answers as we start down this journey. Also, we should beware of quick fixes. For wicked problems, they often take years, decades to make meaningful progress on them. So if someone comes along and claims that one single intervention is going to solve all the problems with policing, you have good reason to be skeptical of that. Given the complexity involved, it's probably going to take a variety of interventions. And that relates to the second point. Just because a single policy doesn't fix everything is not reason to dismiss it. And an analogy I like to bring up here is another wicked problem, climate change. When you think of what do we need to do to bring down CO2 emissions to a more sustainable level, what all the science shows is that you need a number of different interventions in conjunction with one another. And I think it's a similar approach is needed in policing. It's not just a single intervention that's going to get us to where we need to be, but a number of interventions pursued in conjunction with one another. And then lastly, and this relates to the point I made earlier about taking a broader approach to public safety, we need policy experimentation that goes beyond policing. Given how the problems in policing are connected to broader issues in society, we need to be able to do experimentation for other interventions that don't involve the police and see how they can potentially contribute to advancing public safety and making the jobs of officers easier because they're not in such challenging conditions. So without question, very daunting challenges ahead when we think about trying to work towards anti-racist institutions of policing and public safety. But I'd like to close on one small note of optimism, and that is growing interest, at least among some segments of law enforcement, in an anti-racist approach to policing. And so this is perhaps most evident in the Police Race Action Plan that the National Police Chiefs Council in the UK has been working on. This is still in progress. There still further reports, so I don't want to be giving an endorsement to what's outlined in that report or the coming reports. But what I do want to emphasize is there's an explicit endorsement of the idea that policing needs to be anti-racist in its approach. And my co-author and I, we very much agree with that. And we're hoping that this book can help contribute to that work. So I will go ahead and close it there and hand it over to Nicole.
Thank you so much, Ben. Please go ahead, Nicole. Yeah, I was about to introduce you super quick. So we are going to hear Nicole Jambisa. She's a doctor, senior lecturer in criminology by Kingston University. And she will share with us a presentation on Bridging the Gap, a critical exploration of the relationship between deviance and young Black men. Thank you so much, Dr. Nicole Jambisa, and please, you have the word.
Thank you very much, Mauricio. I'm just going to share my screen. Are you all able to see my screen?
We can, but the notes show up.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, there's so many technical difficulties these days. 1 second. Just show it this way. Is that better?
Yes, yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So yes, hi everybody. As Mauricio said, my name is Nicole Nyamwiza and I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Kingston in the UK. So today I'm just going to be giving an overview on a research project of mine which looks at the exploration between the relationship between deviants and young Black men with the hopes of bridging the gap in the dialogue between young Black men and practitioners in probation or criminal justice in general. So the first thing I want to start with is questioning deviance. So the definition of deviance that we're all familiar with is, deviant behavior being any type of behavior that fails to conform with the expectations or norms of any group in society. But one thing that's important is to question our understanding of deviance when it comes to criminal justice practice. Because as we are aware from, some of the things that Ben has touched on in his presentation, deviance is very dependent on race when it comes to criminal justice practice, because some behaviors from some groups in society may be viewed as less or more deviant than others, dependent on their positionality. And as a result, this can unfortunately amplify racial stereotypes and also impact racial disparities in the criminal justice system, which ultimately impacts an individual's experience of crime, law, and justice. So the key thing that I want us to touch on is, why should we explore this? Much of the criminological gaze on racial inequality tends to focus a lot on the, United States. So particularly here in Europe, when we think of police brutality, we tend to focus so much on, America, and almost shift as if it's a problem that we don't have here. That is still, quite a valid stance to have, as research has identified that in 2019, there was only 27 days when a Black person, police were not killed, that the police did not kill anybody in America, and with Black people accounting for more than 3 times of those victims. So that identifies that this is clearly something that we need to explore, because there's racial disparity of policing and ultimately people losing their lives. But as I said, unfortunately, the UK is not innocent. So this has kind of created the scope for my research project, which looks at the connection between deviance and Blackness. What is it about somebody being Black, their skin color, that will encourage there to be reasonable suspicion, or for them to be viewed as, more deviant than somebody else? So racial profiling is something that plays quite a large role in this, and it accounts for the disproportionate high number of young Black people in the justice system, particularly in the youth justice system as well. So Ben mentioned something about stop and frisk. I think in the UK we call it stop and search. So the stop and search statistics are very disproportionate in the UK, and there's often, not a lot of reasonable grounds for suspicion for that occurring. So a recent study actually showed that young Black men and Black boys, so Black children, are overrepresented at every single stage of the criminal justice system, in the adult and youth justice systems. But Black children actually only account for 4% of 10 to 17-year-olds in England and Wales, but make up for 34% of the children in custody or in remand, so when they're waiting to be for their court trial. So that's obviously very problematic, because if we look at, you know, what they account for in society and what they account for in the justice system, there's a disparity there. Another issue that's quite prominent in the UK, I'm sure this is probably the same situation in America, is the adultification of young Black children as well. So in that process of them being adultified, instead of them being treated, you know, and any criminogenic needs they may have being viewed through the lens of them being children, they are adultified and then as a result are subject to harsher sentences. So then that leads me to consider, do Black lives really matter in the UK's criminal justice system? So after the unfortunate killing of George Floyd, there were also a lot of, you know, protests in the UK. There was a lot of traffic from lots of different corporations, you know, businesses, identifying the need for, you know, inclusivity, diversity, and really just ensuring equal rights for everybody. But it got to a point where we have to wonder, you know, whether Black lives really matter to these people, or if was it just, you know, a buzzword or a hashtag. And the key thing to consider as well is sometimes when we think about inequalities amongst different groups, we tend to think about it just on a social level. But actually, in spaces that do matter, so for example, criminal justice, healthcare, education, you know, policy, housing, etc., there still is that disproportionate treatment, racial disparities there as well. There's been research projects that have been done that have found that racial discrimination by judges is frequently most directed towards Black and ethnic minority groups, with people from Black communities, lawyers, witnesses, and defendants, you know, seeing firsthand that experience of discrimination, or also, you know, experiencing it through their friends and families. And as a result, these subgroups were victims of judicial biases, and also perhaps within the jury selection as well. So this goes to show that it's not just a societal problem, but there's actually institutional factors that contribute to this, which create a wider and more difficult issue to address. So a part of my research focuses on Black men's experiences in the probation service and criminal justice. So the main reason for that is, prior to joining the academy, I was a probation officer. So I would often supervise these young men's orders from start to finish. And I would hear a lot of the things that they would have to say. A lot of the research identifies that Black men in general feel quite targeted by the police. So this relates back to the racial profiling that I spoke about, which then creates a distrust of the criminal justice system in general, which then makes the role of the probation officer more difficult, because if you're seen as, you know, working against them and not supporting them, and there's that general distrust, it makes it difficult for them to comply or for them to engage with, you know, the requirements of their orders. With that said, probation staff were generally described as behaving fairly, but also having some judgment at time. But nonetheless, as we were seen as agents of criminal justice, that would still impact how we are able to engage with the service users. So as a result, probation officers needed to be aware of the negative experiences that these men may have, and then how this will impact their compliance and engagement in general. So my experience as a probation officer, seeing it from that side, really did spark my interest, but it was only until I had my own experience with racial profiling that it kind of sparked that, I would say, urgency, a selfish urgency, but I would say that it came from a point of, you know, intellectual humility, in the sense that when I would work with these young people, and they would often say that they felt, you know, targeted or profiled because of the color of their skin, whilst I would try my best to understand, because of my positionality as a woman, you know, despite being Black, as a woman, I didn't have that encounter with the police or, you know, other law enforcement agencies to really understand their perspective, until I had, I would say, quite a low level experience in terms of basically being mistaken for shoplifting, as the security guard thought that I was a young Black, you know, student, school child or something. And as much as it was a compliment, you know, to be told that I looked quite young, there was a lot of profiling going on there. So that kind of sparked my research interest, along with the experiences of the young Black men that I supervised. So my research seeks to develop a dialogue between the practitioners and young Black men that are in touch with the criminal justice system. This is because there's often a lot of misconceptions towards both groups. So the practitioners may not have a good understanding of the needs and experiences of these young Black men, and the young Black men may also feel that they are being judged, or they're not being supported, or may not have a good understanding of the policies that are there to support them. So as a result, my research aims to problematize the relationship between deviance and Blackness, and then critique the rationale behind policies that may impact young Black men in the criminal justice system. And then most importantly, to analyze and explore the experiences of these young Black men in the criminal justice system. So this research really hopes to put these young Black men at the center of the research and allow them to lead the study, as opposed to me, I guess, speaking for them or on behalf of them, as they need to be empowered and also have the ability to share their own experiences to ensure that it's more authentic. So the research methodology will use a three-part approach to researching. So in the sense that I will have individual interviews with these young Black men in the criminal justice system, and then have interviews with the criminal justice practitioners, so namely probation officers or support workers within the probation sector. And then I will then use this information that I gain from all of these interviews to form wider discussions in focus groups with both the probation officers and the service users. But lastly, I will seek to use a participatory action research. So making sure that these young Black men are at the center, making sure that their voices are heard, and most importantly, using that information to gear the discussion as well. Because a key thing that happens in a lot of criminal justice research is we tend to research about them and not with them. So the outcomes for this research project is I hope to develop a better dialogue and working relationship between those in contact with the criminal justice system and those that are working within different organizations. I also hope to improve policies in probation practice, but most importantly, I want to explore the scapegoat mechanism and see what is the purpose of young Black men kind of being advertised as the face of crime. And also using my own positionality as a Black woman, as an academic, and also a previous probation officer to help explore and co-construct new knowledge with the participant group. So whilst this is all very ambitious, I recognize that there may be potential research barriers. So there could be a lot of distrust from the participants because they may see the probation officers as, people that enforce their orders, so not really people there to support them. So they may not want to have that dialogue with them. As a result, this may lead to a lack of transparency, which may mean that, the findings from this study, hopefully this won't occur, but could not be as accurate as possible. Also, it's important to recognize that a lot of people in the criminal justice system may be viewed as a hard to reach community. So building, gaining, and maintaining that communication with them might be difficult. And also researcher bias. I say that because my positionality as an ex-probation officer may skew my understanding of particular concepts that are brought to me, but also my positionality as someone, from the Black community may also increase my bias. So those are constant, conversations that I'm having with fellow researchers and also reflective practice that I'm, engaging in to make sure that that doesn't occur. So that kind of gives an overview of the hopes of my research project. It's currently underway and, going well so far, but if there's any questions at the end, which I'm sure Mauricio said that we will have, I welcome them to see how I can improve or anything I can add to this as well. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Nicole. Thank you so much to both of you. Really interesting topics and the echoes between one situation and the other. So yes, please, we are open to questions, comments. We still have plenty of time to engage in a conversation. So right now we don't have questions in the Q&A section of the seminar, but please raise your voices. And I don't know if you want to share thoughts on each other's presentations too, possible connections, how to collaborate with your communities.
One question I had for Nicole is, what impact, if at all, did the Black Lives Matter movement in the UK have on policy discussions around the criminal justice system and policing?
That's a very good question, Ben. Thank you. I would say that it definitely increased the pressure on the stop and search policies and the I guess police brutality in the UK as well. I would say it kind of like shed a light on it a bit more, because it was something that people are very much aware of, but kind of didn't necessarily speak about it as much because it's kind of viewed as a US problem. I would say on the back end of that, there was a lot of more transparent policing policies, a lot more use of the body cams and things like that, and policies that, they need to be switched on, and also, clearer explanations given to people that are being stopped and searched and things like that. But I wouldn't say there was anything profound that happened on the back end of that, but it was more kind of like a buzz, when it happened, and then kind of business as usual. Because I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but just last year there was a killing of a young unarmed man called Chris Kaba, but there's been a lot of uproar about it. But actually, I think 2 days ago the Met police officer was actually charged with murder, and that hasn't happened in a long time. So I suspect that things such as the Black Lives Matter movement and all of the protests that happened after that definitely influenced that.
And I was reading some about the backlash from the officers. Some of them are refusing to carry a gun that are authorized to carry one. And like, there's that incident, and I know I'm forgetting the victim's name, but the young woman who was raped and killed by a police officer in 2021. So you've had your incidents there.
Yeah, Sarah Everard.
Yeah.
No, it's true, but I always encourage my colleagues, because a lot of, even in our universities, the things that are taught on in police brutality always tends to focus in America, when we have our own cases and issues here as well. But I guess sometimes it's easier to look elsewhere.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I guess a question for you would be, when looking at the policies, because when we tend to try to focus on a global level as well, so we look at cross-cultural perspectives and policies. In America, do you also look at cases in the UK? Do you kind of draw influence, etc., from that?
Yeah, we definitely do that, and we're doing that in the book. And I like to do that because before this project, a lot of my work was on police use of force, especially deadly force. And so the UK, I know it's not perfect, but compared to the US, they have some tactics and training that I think could really benefit officers in the United States. So, like, one example I use, there was a case in the United States down in Florida in 2020, and there was a 63-year-old woman with a fillet knife like you would get out of your kitchen, and she was pointing it at officers. There are two officers. One tried to taser her. The other one shot her immediately when the taser didn't incapacitate her. And, no criminal prosecutions. And that, a lot of officers, that's what they're taught in the United States. If someone gets within 21 feet with an edged weapon, use deadly force. And just how dramatically different the response is, at least in a number of cases from the UK. You'll have, you know, a large man wielding a machete in the street, and, you know, the officers are focused on de-escalating, keeping their distance, and not resorting immediately to deadly force. So I think there are a lot of things that we can learn from looking abroad, and that definitely needs to be part of the analysis. So yeah, definitely, thank you for pointing that out.
Thanks to both of you. We have a question by Athena Stafila. Do you believe that the right to bear arms in the USA makes the police officers fearing and overreact by taking investigative measures? And second part, are there other legal and institutional changes which should be introduced to decompose racial bias of police officers and other members of the criminal justice system?
Thank you. That's I can take a first pass at it. That's a great question. Obviously, the high rates of gun ownership in the United States complicates policing, and, you know, I think the way I sort of view it, and I was influenced by work by Frank Zimring, criminologist. He has a book that came out a few years back, When Police Kill. There are, if we want to bring down, like I showed that figure, around 1,000 individuals are fatally killed in police shootings each year in the US, which is much higher than our peers, even when you adjust for population size. There are certain reforms that we can make to bring that figure down, even with current rates of gun ownership. So if you think about how police respond to someone with a knife or a bat or a chair, you know, those sorts of weapons are not more deadly in the US than they are in the UK, yet we respond very differently in those cases, and officers are trained differently. So I think there are interventions that we can make to bring down the number of killings each year by police. However, I think there's eventually a point where you're going to need changes in gun laws to be able to further chip away at that, because, you know, one of the problems with policing today is that, you know, police are often trained to see everyone as a potential threat, and the high rates of gun ownership that certainly plays a role at that. I do think some of the training, it overemphasizes that risk, and so you get police using deadly force too quickly. But I think it has to be, you have to pursue both approaches, both changes within policing as well as other policy changes that affect society more broadly. In terms of racial bias for officers, you know, this is, you know, if there are interventions that are effective in decreasing individual racial bias, I think, you know, that should be part of the toolkit. But I do think too often there's a focus on racial bias by individual officers and not looking at structural and institutional factors that lead to these racial disparities that we see in policing. And so I guess I see much more promise in identifying those latter factors in making an impact on racial disparities and the disproportionate harms that affect communities of color. So, you know, if we're, do we spend our efforts on a lot of racial bias training for individual officers, or, you know, change how we conduct traffic enforcement and, you know, ending pretextual searches, for instance, stopping people for minor violations, which we know disproportionately impact people of color. And so I think generally the evidence tends to be stronger that those latter sorts of structural policy changes get bigger bang for your buck than trying to reduce bias in individual officers. I'm not saying that those sorts of interventions should not be pursued at all, but I do think we should, try to take a very evidence-based approach. Where there has been some more promising findings is on diversity within police departments. It's certainly not a panacea. You look at the officers who killed Tyree Nichols, they were all African American. So it's not going to solve every problem, but there does seem to be some growing evidence that having more diverse police departments reduces use of force, reduces some other practices that we generally find problematic. So that's an area where I think there definitely should continue to be work and efforts made to further diversify both gender and racial diversity within police departments.
Thank you so much. So for now, that's it. We don't have any other questions. So I don't know if you want to do a quick round of final thoughts, and maybe we can close with that.
You want me to start?
Yeah, I don't mind.
Okay. Final thoughts. Yeah, so this project is, we have some parts drafted of it. It's in its early stages. But really hoping that, one thing we do want to do related to Nicole's point earlier is doing some cross-national analysis and seeing what we can learn from policing and public safety approaches across the world, and how that could potentially benefit debates about policing and public safety here in the US. So I really appreciate her raising that point, and it's something that we hope to do as the project continues to develop.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Ben. I guess for me, my final points would be, unfortunately, as we can see, police brutality is a global issue. And again, even though we tend to focus in the West, even in the global South, it's still, a major issue. If we think about, the End SARS in Nigeria, where you have, I guess, Black police officers also still harming and issues with their policing of a majority Black population as well, which can lead us to actually address that. Is the issue the location or just the fundamental values of policing in general? And also I've been looking at, how inherited policing systems behave as well. So that's another conversation. But I'd say overall, it's key for us to acknowledge that it is a global issue. There is room for, as Ben mentioned, global collaboration to look at that. But I would say for me, what's really important is making sure that it is led by those that are impacted most, because I guess they are the experts of their lived experiences. So for us to continue pushing for us to almost be facilitators to help them, speak and advocate for themselves, but also use our skills to, analyze and critically convey and discuss those matters. So I hope maybe, Ben, we can keep in touch and have conversations in the future around this.
That'd be terrific.
Wow. So thank you so much for both your participation. It was quite interesting panel. So with this, we close for now. And please join for the rest of the conference here in the room 2. We will have our next panel, Conflict Resolution and Reconciliation, in about 20 minutes. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mauricio. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.